In the flickering light of ancient hearths, long before the rise of kingdoms and empires, humans were already at war. Not against monarchs or armies, but against the wild, the hunger that gnawed at their bellies, and sometimes against each other. This is the forgotten history, the shadows of the past that often remain hidden behind layers of myths and legends. A history steeped in survival, fear, and an instinctive drive that at times turned humanity into something darker. Welcome to Prehistoric Medievals. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our weekly journeys into humanity's most primal and mysterious past. It's easy to romanticize the early days of human civilization, stone tools, firelight, dancing in caves, and the forging of communities. But beneath that early humanity was something far more raw. Cannibalism, a practice that stains archaeological records from the caves of Spain to the valleys of Ethiopia, across the cold frontiers of Homo sapiens and the rough landscapes of Neanderthals. This is not a story of madness. It's not a tale of savagery. It's the story of how desperate times often forced human beings to cross moral lines for survival, power, and even spiritual meaning.
In the shadows of the Paleolithic, where the cold wind howled and the scent of blood mingled with the smoke of fires, survival came at a steep price. Cannibalism wasn't just about hunger. It was often a matter of ritual, of memory, and even of respect. Far from being an act of desperation, it was, at times, a deeply ritualistic practice that tied the living to the dead, the strong to the weak, and the victorious to the fallen. To understand this, we must step back into a time where the rules we know today had not yet been written, where survival meant relying not just on strength, but on the ability to adapt, and sometimes to consume what was once human. Now, take a moment to think about this. In places like Gough's Cave in England or El Cidrón in Spain, evidence points to a very deliberate and methodical practice. This was no frantic, mindless consumption. Skulls weren't just crushed, they were meticulously cleaned and reshaped, turned into ceremonial vessels or even bowls. Femurs, long bones, were split with purpose to extract the marrow, the vital, life-sustaining fatty core that meant survival in a world where food could vanish at a moment's notice. These weren't the markings of a predator hunting for a meal. These were the marks of a people using tools with intent, not out of madness, but out of necessity. Who were the victims? Sometimes they were enemies, taken in battle and consumed as a symbol of dominance. Other times they were family, kin who had passed, elders, or even the brave who volunteered, sacrificing themselves for the good of the tribe. This was the true face of survival. Sacrifice wasn't just a concept, it was a way of life. When hunger called, the dead fed again.
But cannibalism wasn't only about hunger or even power. It was also about reverence. For some ancient tribes, consuming the flesh of the dead wasn't desecration. It was an act of love. It was a final gift, a way to ensure that the spirit, the strength, and the wisdom of the deceased would live on. In cultures from Papua New Guinea to prehistoric Europe, the belief was simple. By consuming the dead, the living absorbed their essence. A father's courage, a mother's tenderness, all passed on through the flesh of those who had gone before. What might seem grotesque to modern minds was an honor to the ancients, a final act of unity, a return to the earth, and a bond that death could not sever. However, not all instances of cannibalism were rooted in reverence. In the darkest corners of history, cannibalism served a more sinister purpose: conquest. In times of war, to consume the flesh of an enemy wasn't just to defeat them, it was to erase them, to obliterate their gods, their names, their very being. It was a way to ensure they never rose again. In those brutal times, death wasn't just an end, it was a message. It was preparation for what came after. When Homo sapiens ventured into Ice Age Europe, they didn't find an empty land waiting for them. They encountered the Neanderthals, a species every bit as intelligent, as fierce, and as determined to survive as they were. In the beginning, there may have been distance, even an uneasy coexistence. But as the ice sheets receded and the glaciers retreated, the silence between the two species would give way to something far darker. This wasn't a meeting between man and beast, it was a collision between two apex predators. The Cro-Magnons, our direct ancestors, brought with them tools, tactics, and cooperation. They were masters of strategy, hunters of long range, and they adapted quickly to the open terrain. The Neanderthals, however, had brute strength, ambush tactics, and a deep knowledge of the forests, and when the two collided, survival meant everything.
When the battle ended, the horror began. Some Neanderthal bodies weren't buried. They were butchered, skinned, and their bones cracked for marrow. This wasn't scavenging. This was methodical, efficient butchery. This wasn't just about surviving an attack. It was about claiming dominance. The Cro-Magnons, in their cold, relentless world, did not just outlive the Neanderthals, they consumed them. The bones and the flesh of the defeated Neanderthals weren't just trophies, they were the spoils of war. The victors didn't merely claim land or tools, they consumed the very essence of their rivals. Before we move further into this fascinating and unsettling story, make sure to subscribe to Prehistoric Medievals so we can continue exploring this untold part of our past. We'll go deeper into the brutal survival tactics, rituals, and strategies that formed the foundations of who we are today. Stay with us, because the darkness of history holds lessons we can't afford to ignore. As we move deeper into the Ice Age, the Cro-Magnons were not just surviving, they were evolving, adapting in ways that left a permanent mark on human history. They were giants, not just in stature, but in intellect. These people stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, imposing figures against a frozen backdrop of prehistoric Europe. Their skulls, when uncovered centuries later, revealed something unexpected. They weren't the brutish, hunched figures of primitive man as many once thought. Instead, the Cro-Magnons were more akin to us, complex, capable, and advanced. Their bones spoke of a species that had mastered survival not just through strength, but through intellect, art, and cunning. When 19th-century scientists uncovered their remains in caves across France, they were stunned by what they found. These were not the primitive ancestors they had expected, but rather a people who had developed advanced tools, crafted exquisite bone needles, and even fashioned musical instruments from mammoth ivory. Cro-Magnons were artisans, creators, not just hunters. Their culture was one of survival and expression, of art and memory, carved into cave walls with red ochre and coal. These weren't just people struggling to survive, they were building a legacy, leaving behind images that would whisper across the ages, reminding us of their existence.
And what of their enemies? What of the Neanderthals, the other species that once shared this harsh world? Were they simply consumed, erased from history in a single brutal clash of survival? Not exactly. It's clear that for the Cro-Magnons, the battle didn't just end with victory, It ended with ritual. Neanderthal bones were sometimes found not just butchered, but worn as trophies. Skulls were turned into ornaments or helmets. These weren't just signs of war, they were signs of memory. To wear the skull of an enemy was not just to claim dominance over their body, it was to claim victory over their spirit, to erase them from the world entirely. In the Cro-Magnon world, war didn't just take place on the battlefield, it extended into the realm of the mind. These people knew that fear, spectacle, and ritual could be just as powerful as any weapon. Psychological warfare was as much a part of their strategy as anything else. Bone masks, skulls arranged in chilling formations. These were not the marks of savagery, but of a deliberate, calculated campaign. The Cro-Magnons weren't just hunting animals, they were hunting minds, creating an aura of fear and dominance. Their enemies were made to understand the message. Cross us, and you become one of them. Your flesh will be stripped, your bones arranged to send a message to anyone who dares to approach. To rival tribes, these were not just trophies of war. They were psychological weapons, tools for intimidation. Fear was their currency, and they spent it wisely. As we move through this savage landscape, we come to realize that these people, these early humans, were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their place in the world, for their identity. In the cold, unforgiving climate, fire was as much a weapon as a tool for warmth. It became an instrument of terror, a way to lay siege to those who would stand in their way. The Cro-Magnons didn't always fight their enemies face to face. Sometimes they set the world on fire.
Fire wasn't just used to cook or keep warm. It was used to burn out the enemy. In territorial conflicts, the Cro-Magnons didn't storm caves or chase their enemies across the land. Instead, they smoked them out. They would light fires at the mouth of caves, choking out their adversaries with smoke. Blind, coughing, and gasping for air, their enemies were rendered helpless. And when the smoke cleared, the spears came next. It was a slow, merciless siege, a warfare of attrition that broke down not just the body, but the spirit. The mastery of fire was one of the most devastating tools in the early human arsenal. It spread fear, terrorizing entire regions. It wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon that turned the cold landscape into a battleground where the flames ruled. And for those who could harness its power, fire wasn't just about survival, it was about control. It made warriors into warlords, and those who commanded it were more than just survivors. They were rulers of the ice and the snow. But the Cro-Magnons weren't the only ones to shape the world of the Ice Age. Before them, there was another species, Homo heidelbergensis. This ancient ancestor lived long before the Neanderthals or Cro-Magnons. Towering and mysterious, they roamed Europe and beyond, carving their legacy not in words or art, but in bones. The remains of Homo heidelbergensis, found in caves like Atapuerca, Spain, tell a chilling tale. These bones weren't just chewed on by predators. They were deliberately cut, stripped of flesh, and processed with tools made by human hands. These were not the marks of chaos. These were the deliberate actions of a species learning to survive in a brutal world. The bones speak of a cold, calculating process. Skulls were removed, femurs split for marrow. The world was changing. The great beasts that had once roamed the earth were disappearing. The mammoths, the rhinos, the vast herds of animals that once provided food and shelter were vanishing. And as the climate shifted, the pressure mounted. In such a world, survival demanded tough choices. Sometimes the only source of meat left was each other.
This wasn't savagery. It was an adaptation, a brutal evolution under pressure. Homo heidelbergensis, like the Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals after them, had to find ways to survive. And when food was scarce, when the seasons shifted unpredictably, when death loomed at every corner, they did what they had to. They turned to each other, and in the process, they forged the very foundation of human survival. But this wasn't just about necessity. This was a system of survival, a cold, calculating decision in the face of extinction. When faced with the choice between death and consumption, the early humans chose the latter. They were not driven by cruelty. They were driven by the need to survive, to keep their communities alive. And in that brutal act, they became something more than just animals. They became human. Before we move on, don't forget to subscribe to Prehistoric Medievals for more insights into the darkest corners of our past. The stories we tell are often the ones we hide away, the ones we forget. But they are just as important as the triumphs, the victories, and the peaceful moments. So stick with us as we uncover more about humanity's origins, where survival didn't just mean existing. It meant becoming something more.